How to sew the Patchy slouch bag with Amber Makes. Choose a mixture of fat 8s for this easy to make slouchy bag. Just follow me and I'll show you how. Cutting out. The bag front and back out are made from a selection of fabric squares sewn together. So choose the fabric that you want to use, and you will also need some fabric to use for the lining. Trace around the bag top template, making sure you mark the fold line and also the bag corner template. This is in the instructions. From a mixture of print or plain fabrics, cut all your fabric squares. The number and the measurements for these are listed in the instructions, so cut all these squares in advance, as it's much easier to do the patchwork if you cut everything out first and put them in a pile. And then from the lining fabric you will need to cut 2 pieces to line the bag, and again the measurements are listed in the instructions. Organising the fabrics. You need 24 squares for the front outer of the bag and 24 squares for the back outer. So take your 24 squares for the front outer and you need to lay them out. It's important that you lay them out in the order that you want them to be. So you might want a very definite order, or you might want them just random. So you need to have 6 rows, and there are 4 squares in each row. So you can see I've got the top row and now I've got the second row, and I'm going to place the row before that. I would lay all of them out to start with, and then you can move them around if you want, because even if you want a random effect, you might not want 2 of the same squares next to each other, and by laying out all 24 it means you can rearrange them. Obviously you might have a very specific order and then you can do that as you go, but you can see here I'm just going to swap a couple of squares round. Then you can see whether you like them, move them about, and then you can see how they work together. So once you're happy with the placement, then label them. So this is the last row, so place them on top of each other with the first square on the top and label it. So this is the front outer, row 6, and then I've done that with all of the other rows, row 5, row 4, row 3, 2 and 1. It's easier if you label them, and then when you sew them together later, you don't have to think about it. And here's all the back outer. I've done that in exactly the same way. Laid them all out and labelled them by just writing the label and pinning through. Now your fabrics are all organised. Piecing the squares. Now take the 4 squares in the front outer row 1, and then you need to sew them together. So it's important that you keep the label on. So just put that label on the first piece and then place them out in order. So you've got piece 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now place them, the first 2 right sides together, so you're joining the right hand side of the first square to the left hand side of the second square, and just pin those together. Then take the next square, so square 3, and pin that to square 2, making sure all the raw edges are matching up exactly. I like to pin them together all in one row and then go and sew them together. The squares are big enough to be able to do this. And then pin the 4th square in row 1. Again, make sure the raw edges are matching. Put a pin, 2 or 3 pins in to hold them in place. Now you can sew all of these squares together all along those pin seams to make row 1. And when you've done it, it will look like this. So make all the other rows in the same way. Again, make sure you keep the label on them, because when you sew all these rows together, you need to know which is row 1, which is row 2, 1, 3, and so on, because obviously you've placed them in a specific order when you arrange them and you want to keep them in that order. Now to join them together, it's easier if you nest the seams, but to do this you need to press them to one side. So for row 1, press the seams away from the first square. So we're pressing them to the right, over to one side. Once you've pressed them from the back over to one side, press them again from the front just to set them and to remove any creases. Now, row 2 has to have the seams pressed in the opposite direction. So turn it over and press the seams over to one side towards the first square. So if you think of the odd numbered rows go away from the first square, the even numbered rows go towards. So you can see number 3 goes away from the first square, row 4 goes towards the first square, row 5 goes away from the first square, and row 6, the seams are pressed towards the first square. Now you'll be able to nest them, having pressed them in advance. So take row 1 and place row 2 below it. Now we're going to join them together, so place them on top of each other, making sure the raw edges are matching. And to nest the seams, take row 2, place the seam a little bit to the right of row 1, and then slide it very gently, and you will find that the seams will just stop and crash together if you do it very slowly. And this is because the bulk of the seams turned over to one side adds a little shelf, and where those two shelves meet, they join together, and this is what nesting seams means. They nest or they join together, and this means that you don't have to look to join them. You just wait till the two little shelves of the seams butt up against each other and then pin them together through that seam. Once you've nested all the seams, pin together at the end, and then making sure the raw edges match, pin together all the way across. Now you can sew these 2 rows together, and it will look like this. So because you've got all of those seams pressed over to one side, to reduce the bulk a bit, press this seam open and flat. It just helps for the patchwork to lay a bit flatter. So there's row 1 and row 2 joined, and then press it from the right sides, and you can see with nesting the seams how neatly they join up. So you get a really nice, neat patchwork effect. When you've done that, join row 3 below row 2 and row 4 below row 3. Again, don't forget to nest the seams as you go, because you've already pressed them over to one side. It's easy. And then finally join on row 5 and row 6. Once you've done that, the whole of the front of the bag is patchwork for it is now finished, and you can see all of my seams are pressed over to one side, and then the main seams are pressed open. You can now remove all of the row labels because you won't need these anymore. But do keep the label at the top just so that you know that this is the front outer, so you can differentiate between this and the back outer. So just pop that there just for when you're cutting out, particularly if you've chosen the fabrics for the front and the back to be different. Then repeat this process to sew together the rows and join the rows for all of the rows and the pieces for the back outer. And again, put the label at the top so you know what the difference is between the front outer and the back outer. Although they're the same size, you might have chosen fabrics and you want them to be different. So there's your front outer and your back outer finished. Cutting the bag shape. Take your pieced front outer and fold it in half lengthways with wrong sides facing, along the seam that you've already joined the squares together. Now take the template and place the top of the template, so this is the bag top template, place the top on the top left-hand corner. That's not the fold, but the top left-hand corner, and pin that into place. And then the section that you've marked fold on this template, make sure that's on the fold. The template is made so it's exactly the same size as your pieced squares, because you don't need a template for the whole bag, you just need this curved top. So make sure the fold is on the fold and the top is at the top. And then once you're happy, it's all laying nice and flat, then pin around the curve a bit, because you're going to be cutting around this curve, so if you pin it into place it will just hold it nice and neat. Now take the bag corner template and place that on the bottom corner. It's really important that you place it on the corner opposite the fold, so it has to be on the left hand edges, not on the fold, because this is going to cut the nice curved shape, so make sure it's opposite the fold. And then pin it into place, just a few places. Make sure you pin through both layers, because you're going to be cutting through both layers at once. Now you need to cut around that curve, so you have this piece here, and then you need to cut around the corner. So now when you open up the front outer, you've got that top inner curved edge, and you've got the bottom corners all nice and curved as well. So your front outer is now finished. Repeat this to cut the back outer in exactly the same way. So it's identical and they're both symmetrical. Now use that template to cut the two lining pieces in the same way. So it's folded, the lining is folded in half. You use the template to cut it, just like this, and then the back lining. So the lining pieces and the front outer, the back outer are all identical. Now, if you want to add extra slip pockets, the pieces that you've cut out, you can use to make little pockets. So if you take one lining piece and then one of the cut out pieces, place them right sides together and sew them, leaving a turning gap. You can turn them right sides out, and these can become little slip pockets which you can sew to the lining of the bag. But this isn't optional, it's just if you want to use all of the fabric and make some little slip pockets, that's a really nice way of doing it. Now stay stitch all the way around the curved edges. So this is a stitch which worked within the seam allowance. Use a stitch length of about 3, and it stops the seams coming undone where you've trimmed them and just adds a little bit of stability. So do that for the front outer and the back outer, just around those curved edges to stop the patchwork seams coming undone. Details of all of this stitching are all in the instructions to help you. Now, if you want to quilt your bag, you can do that at this stage. Place the front outer and the back outer right sides up on top of some wadding, and then all I've done is quilted 1/8 of an inch outside of all of the patchwork seams. It gives the bag more structure, but is optional. Joining the front outers and linings. Place the front outer and the back outer right sides facing, making sure all the raw edges match up. So I'm going to pin together at the top edge, and then pin together at the bottom curved edge. Remember, the front outer and the back outer are all the same, both the same size, so they will match up nicely. Now, to get a really nice perfect finish, also match up where you've joined the squares together. So if you match up those seams, all I've done is just rolled one on cross atop the other. You can push a pin through them to make sure they match up. It just means when you do have your finished bag, those seams will match up exactly. So I've pinned together at each seam, and obviously they're the same size, so they will match, but because fabric can shift a little bit while you're sewing, if you just pin them at each seam to anchor them, then when you finish your bag, those seams will all match up, and that will just give you a neater finish. So take the time to go around and pin them on each seam. All the way right up to the top, and then pin together along the top edge as well, making sure that the raw edges match. And it's much easier then when you sew it together if everything is pinned and anchored into place. And then there's the final seam to just pin together. Now you can sew it together, but don't sew across the top straight edges and don't sew around the curved edge. You're just sewing down the side, around the curved bottom, along the bottom, around the other curve and up the other side, but don't sew across those top straight edges. Once it's finished, it will look like this. Now you need to make sure you press this seam open. So at the top edge, you'll find it easier to lay it flat and press it open. When you get round to the sides, it might not be so easy. So just fold the seam over to one side and press it instead. If you press it at this stage, it just helps it to lay flat and neater when the whole bag is finished. So that's the front outer and the back outer joined together. The two lining pieces are joined together in exactly the same way. So place the front lining right sides up and place the back lining right sides down on top. They're exactly the same size, and it's a bit quicker this time because you haven't got any seams to match up. The only difference is you need to leave a turning gap in this lining for turning the bag right sides out later. So match up the bottom edge. If you just push it across with your fingers, you can make sure all those raw edges are matching up. And then place a few pins along the curved edges and along the bottom edge. Again, arranging the fabric, just pushing it gently with your fingers to make sure that the raw edges match. And then pop a pin in the centre to hold it. Now measure to find the centre. I've still got a crease in mine where I folded it with the template so I can see where the centre is, but measure it if you're not sure, and then measure and mark 2 inches either side of that so that you can leave a 4-inch gap unstitched. So the gap between those two marks is the gap you'll leave unstitched. So pin it together at the top and then down the sides, making sure the raw edges match up. And then pin it together on the other side, making sure that the raw edges at the top match up and that the raw edges down the sides match up as well. Now, once it's all pinned together, you can sew it in the same way as you did with the outers. Don't sew across the top straight edge and don't sew around the curved and the other top straight edge, leave that unstitched. So sew together down the side, stop stitching one side of the turning gap and reverse stitch, then start stitching again at the other side of the turning gap, reverse stitching, and stop stitching at the top, always reverse stitch at the beginning and the end of all your seams. And then it will look like this. In the same way as with the outer, press those seams open and flat. Where you get to the curved edges and it's a little bit trickier, just fold one seam allowance over to the side. With the turning gap, fold the seam allowances over to the wrong side so it's level with the seam allowances. And that's your lining joined together. Joining the outer and lining. Turn the bag outer right sides out, but leave the bag lining wrong sides out. Now place the outer inside the lining and then they will be right sides facing. So just push it inside. find it easier if I fold the outer in half and then push it inside. Now match up the top edges. It's important that the seams match for the lining seams and the outer seams. So make sure they're laying right on top of each other and also that they're pressed open and flat. So pin them together on one side seam and then work your way round and pin them on the other side seam. So again, make sure that the seams overlap each other and that they stay pressed open and flat. Once you've pinned them together at the top, on the left-hand side, on the bag front, measure 3 inches down from that top corner, just like this. Pop a pin in there, and then you can use a pin, but I mark it with an erasable pen just because it stays. Mark it on the lining side, so 3 inches down from the top, because this is a gap that we're going to leave unstitched for turning it out later, for joining the tops of the handles. So that mark is important. So pin it together. Now the outer and the lining is the same size, so pin it together all the way around to the centre. Now I've still got the centre marks on my lining from where I fold it, and obviously the centre of the outer is where the patchwork is. But if you want to be sure, you can mark these in advance and then pin it matching that curved edge all the way round. Just adjust it to make sure that the raw edges are matching up. Now on the top of the other side, measure and mark 3 inches down from the top. So remember, you're doing this on the front lining side. Measure 3 inches down from the top, pin it together at the top corner and pin it together at that mark. And then you can pin the rest of the curve around back to the centre. So basically you're pinning the front lining to the front outer, but you are leaving the top 3 inches on both sides will be unstitched. So that's why you've placed the mark. So you can now stitch them together, start at the mark, work all the way around to the curve and stop at the other mark. And then it will look like this, and you can see the top 3 inches is unstitched. So just pin it all the way around and leave that top 3 inches unstitched. Now turn it over, and on the back outer and the back lining, pin it together all the way round. You don't need to do the mark this time. You pin it right up to the top and sew it together. And then it will look like this. So on the back, it's pinned and sewn together all the way, the top all the way around the curve, and on the front you've got 3 inches left unstitched. Now to help this curve to turn nice and evenly, just cut little snips through all the fabric layers and the wadding if you've put that in, just up to the seam. Now I've placed my snips about 1/4 of a half inch apart. Make sure you don't cut into the seam, so just a couple of fabric threads inside it, just around the curve, because when you turn your bag right sides out later, it will just help it to stay all nice and flat. So do that all the way around, but don't cut on the top edges, just the curves. Finishing off. Now you've sewn and clipped all of the bag, you need to turn it right sides out through the turning gap that you left in the lining. So turn it all right sides out by just pushing your hand right inside and pulling the bag all the way through. The gap that you've left is big enough to do this, but do it fairly gently as you don't want to split the seams at all. So put it all right sides out. So push it through. Now it's important as well that you pull out the strap sections so that the whole of the outer and the lining is right sides out. So once you've done the main bag itself, push your hand inside and then pull out those strap sections as well. Because remember, you left the top unstitched, the top straight edge. So you can pull it all the way through. And then do the other strap section as well. But because you left the top straight edges and that extra 3 inch unstitched, this is easy to do. So just pull out the whole thing and now your whole bag is turned right sides out. So before we join the straps together, we need to close the turning gap. So lay the lining down flat and turn those edges back under by 1/4 inch. You pressed them early, but they may have come turned over again with all the pulling right sides out. So turn them back under by 1/4 inch. Give them a press if they're creased at all. Pin them together so the turned under edges match up. And then sew them together. Now you can top stitch them by machine, but if you want your bag to be reversible, then slip stitch them by hand. And then if you use the lining as the outside of the bag at all, it won't be seen. I've top stitched mine because I'm not going to use mine as a reversible bag, but it can be if you want it to be, but do slip stitch. Now push the lining back inside the bag and just push your hands in so that the curved bottom corners of the lining meet the curved bottom corners of the outer. So it's all nice and neatly inside. Now before we sew the straps together, you need to press the edges of the lining and the outer. So just put them on your ironing board or mat, roll them between your fingers and give them a press. It's important that this seam lies right on the edge. We'll be top stitching it later, so it's a lot neater if you press it so the seam lays right on the edge. And because you clip the curves, you'll find that this lays quite nice and neatly. So do that all the way round. And the top unstitched edge, that 3 inches, I'm just folding those edges under by 1/4 inch so it's level with the seam below it, and I'm giving those a press as well. So you can see the lining and the outer, just fold them under. Now I've pressed it to get all the way round, I can join the straps together. So take the straps, you can see I've got them right sides looking at each other. Now place them right sides facing. So you've got the front outer and the back outer. Line up the outer edge and then line up the seam on the patchwork, making sure that the seam matches exactly and pin together. And then line up the seam that joins the outers to the linings. Again, make sure it sits exactly on top. You can push a pin through that seam as a placement pin if you prefer, or just layer it and make sure it matches up. Then you can match up the top seam on the lining and then match up the raw edges of the lining. So basically you're pinning the 2 ends of the straps right sides facing, making sure you match up the seams. And it will look like this. Just double check you haven't got anything twisted before you sew. If you just open it up like I just did, you'll know it's not twisted. And then sew it together all the way along this pinned edge. And once you've done it, it will look like this. Press that seam open so it's nice and flat. And then because I pressed those edges under by 1/4 inch earlier, they'll match up nicely. So just pin them together, making sure that the folded edge matches up exactly. So it looks like it's been seamed in the same way as the rest of the top of the bag. So just take your time here to make sure that those edges are folded under by 1/4 inch and that you match up the seams. And now you can pin it in place. Now what you need to do is top stitch the lining and the outers together. So top stitch all the way around the front lining and the front outer, and then all the way around the back lining and the back outer. And that will hold the lining in place and make it really neat. Now give it a good press and your bag is now finished. So you can see you've just got that one handle that you can just sling over your shoulder. You've got a nice curved opening. The handle at the top, the strap is all joined together so it looks like it's just one piece with a nice curved bottom. If you want your bag to be reversible, you can just turn it with the lining side out and it's a reversible bag. And then turn it back and there's your Patchy slouch bag. All finished and ready to take shopping with you. Easy, simple to do and uses up all those scraps.